It is a melancholy truth, too often overlooked by those who prefer their tragedies brisk and their newspapers brisker, that the English countryside is never so picturesque as when it is about to do something perfectly horrible. Lord Peter Death-Bredden Wimsey was saying this, or something excessively like it, to Mr. Parker as the Bentley slid with the mild, feline assurance of an expensive animal along the Hertfordshire lanes. February lay on the hedges in the form of damp and patient greyness. There were puddles that reflected the sky with an accuracy bordering upon rudeness, and bare elms that looked as though they had been sketched in by a draftsman who had suddenly lost interest. One passed, here and there, a cottage that pretended to be asleep, and beyond them, fields with that resigned expression which fields wear in winter, means as if they had heard the worst and were waiting for the rest. "I only mean," said Wimsey, lighting a cigarette with elaborate fastidiousness, "that the rustic ideal is an invention of town-dwellers who have never had to clean mud off a dog at midnight. And if you will insist upon bringing murder into it, you must not complain when the thing takes on a certain, shall we say, agricultural frankness." Parker, who was never quite sure whether to be amused or irritated by his friend's conversational arabesques, kept his eyes on the road. "The chief constable's telegram didn't sound agricultural," he said. "It sounded, well, odd." "It is the odd ones," returned Wimsey, "that have the best manners. Ordinary crime is such a bore. Everybody shouting, everybody lying, everybody in a hurry. But an odd crime will sit down, fold its hands, and wait politely for you to notice it, like a spider in a corner. Which reminds me, do you happen to know whether the rector at Fenchurch Street Stephen keeps spiders?" "I don't," said Parker. "And I can't see, nor can you ever," murmured Wimsey, "until the moment arrives. That is precisely the charm of ignorance." They were going to Rookwood Grange. In 1937, Rookwood Grange had been the residence of Sir Lionel Darracott, a gentleman of that amiable and obstinate type which breeds in England like ivy, educated at the right places, married at the right time, and possessed of the right kind of money, meaning, in this case, money that appeared to have been in the family since the Conquest, and was still faintly surprised by the idea of taxation. Sir Lionel had collected clocks, not the nice, domesticated sort that tick discreetly on a mantelpiece and are content to tell you the hour, but great, arrogant machines, long-cased, turreted, musical, that chimed, struck, whispered, and sang, and generally behaved as though time itself were a private property. Sir Lionel, in the autumn of that year, had hanged himself in the clock-room. The verdict had been suicide. The family had accepted it, as families accept what they cannot alter. The village had improved it, as villages improve everything, into a story. By the time the war came, the tale had acquired that faint patina of the supernatural which clings to any death that takes place in a locked room and in the vicinity of machinery. Sir Lionel's ghost was said to walk at 12:30, when the clocks, if they were still wound, ought to strike 13. And it is, of course, one of the more tiresome habits of the English to refer to any old sorrow as a ghost, and then to be surprised when it behaves in a manner perfectly consistent with human nature. The telegram, which had fetched Parker, and by the natural magnetism of scandal Wimsey, out of London had been brief enough to satisfy the most puritanical tastes. Come at once. Rookwood Grange. Body found in clock room. Strange document. Possible connection. 1937. Case. Denton, C.C. "A body," said Parker, as the Grange's chimneys appeared through a veil of leafless trees. "Not Sir Lionel's this time." "No," said Wimsey. "Sir Lionel's body has been very obliging about remaining dead. It is the living who are so restless." Rookwood Grange presented itself with that air of dignified disapproval which old houses assume when the modern world encroaches upon them. It stood back from the drive, squarely Georgian in its front, with later, more self-indulgent wings that suggested Sir Lionel's ancestors had acquired both money and confidence as time went on. The windows were large and polite. The door had a fan light that looked like an inquisitive eyebrow. The gravel crunched under the Bentley's tires with the mild reproach of long-established habit. A man came down the steps to meet them. Inspector Denton, a large-featured fellow with that bulldog gravity which makes policemen look as though they had been carved out of conscience. His eyes flicked over whimsy with the resigned recognition of one who has been warned that a lord is coming and has no choice but to endure it. "Thank God you're here," he said to Parker, and then, with an effort at civility, "Lord Peter." "Inspector," said Whimsy with exquisite friendliness. "How delightful to meet again under circumstances so entirely suitable for a police photograph. Pray tell me, are we to have anything dramatic? A secret passage? A poisoned chalice? Or merely the traditional corpse in the best room?" Denton did not smile. "It's in the clock room," he said, "and well, you'd better see." Inside, the Grange smelt of cold polish and old textiles, the smell of houses that have been kept shut against the weather and the world. Somewhere, faintly, one heard the ticking of something large and self-satisfied. They were met in the hall by a woman who might once have been handsome in an uncompromising way and had decided, since then, to take refuge in capability. She was in her late 40s, dressed in black tweed as though mourning were a profession, and her hair was dragged back so severely that it appeared to be holding her school together. "This is Mrs. Craddock," said Denton. "Housekeeper." Mrs. Craddock inclined her head to Parker, and rather more slightly to Whimsy. "We were not expecting," she began. "Nobody ever expects anything in a house with a clock room," said Whimsy. "That is the point of them. They are designed to startle the unwary by continuing to exist." Mrs. Craddock's mouth tightened. She was a woman who had spent her life in charge of silver and linen and had no patience with cleverness that did not lead to clean results. "It's a dreadful business," she said. "Yes," said Whimsy. "It is always dreadful. But the question is, who has taken the trouble to be dreadful, and why?" Denton led them through a panelled corridor. The house's silence thickened as they went, as though they were walking deeper into an argument that had never been concluded. The ticking grew louder, multiplied, became a kind of subdued chorus. At the end of the corridor was a door with a brass plate that read, "In careful engraving, the horologium." "Sir Lionel's joke," said Denton. "Latin, he called it that." Whimsy's eyebrows rose. "Ah, horologium. Timepiece. Also, if one is being pedantic, a sundial. Delightful. The dead do so love precision." Denton opened the door. The clock room was not large, but it was crowded, as though time had moved in and refused to pay rent. The tall cases stood against the walls, oak, mahogany, walnut, some plain, some ornamented with cherubs who looked uncomfortably aware of mortality. On a central table lay smaller clocks, their faces turned upward like white, accusing eyes. A long, narrow window admitted a thin daylight. The glass was old, imperfect, and made the garden outside appear warped, as though reality itself had been bent by too much measuring. And in the middle of the room, on the parquet floor, lay a man. He was perhaps 35, well dressed in the manner of one who buys his clothes from a good tailor but does not trust his own taste. His hair was fair and neatly cut. His hands, visible where they lay palms upward, were pale and clean. There was something curiously deliberate about his posture, as though he had been arranged to make a point, and a small dark stain spread beneath his head, absorbing itself into the wood with the slow patience of ink. A constable stood by the door, looking as though he would have preferred to be anywhere else in creation. "Name?" said Parker, kneeling. "Mr. Adrian Whelpdale," said Denton. "Secretary to Mr. Jasper Darracott. That's Sir Lionel's nephew, current owner. Mr. Darracott's in the library." Shock. Whimsy wandered. not towards the body, but towards the clocks. He leaned close to a tall, long case with a moon-phase dial, peering as though it were a painting. He listened. He sniffed faintly, like a connoisseur detecting a forgery. "What time is it?" he asked suddenly. Parker, without looking up, replied automatically, "Just gone 11. Whimsy nodded. "And what time do the clocks say?" Denton stared. "What?" Whimsy's voice remained light. "Now to humor me, Inspector. One cannot have a proper mystery in a clock room without establishing what the clocks think about it. They are, after all, the local authorities." Denton, with an expression that suggested he did not enjoy being made ridiculous in front of his men, said, "Most of 'em are stopped." "Of course they are," said Whimsy pleasantly. "They always are. Stopped clocks are the natural habitat of crime." He moved from case to case. Some faces showed 9 minutes past 2. Another showed precisely 12:30. A smaller bracket clock on the table had stopped at 13 minutes to 1. Its second hand caught mid-twitch as though surprised. "One running?" Whimsy asked. "A few," said Denton. "Mister, Darracott has someone in once a week to wind the main ones." Whimsy paused at a clock in a carved case, an absurd rococo affair with gilt vines and a cherub clinging to the dial like a climbing child. Its pendulum moved with a gentle, relentless swing. "That one," said Whimsy, "is alive." Parker looked up, irritated despite himself. "Peter, I know," said Whimsy. "Body first. But the clocks are part of the furniture, and furniture is the soul of an English crime." He returned at last to the dead man. Parker had uncovered the head and was examining the wound. "Blunt force," Parker said quietly. "Heavy object, no sign of struggle. He's been struck from behind." Denton nodded. "We've found no weapon yet." Whimsy crouched, his immaculate trousers protesting. He did not touch the body. He did not need to. His gaze moved instead to the man's right hand. Between the fingers, held with a curious, stubborn pressure, was a folded piece of paper. "It was like that when we found him," said Denton quickly. "We haven't opened it. Thought might be important." Whimsy's eyes narrowed, not with excitement, but with that sharp inward attention which makes a man look suddenly older. "A message," he said softly. "A last message. How obliging." Parker held out a gloved hand. "Shall I?" Whimsy's voice was mild. "No. Let me." He produced from nowhere a small pair of tweezers, as though he had anticipated the needs of murder as other men anticipate luncheon. With careful delicacy, he eased the paper free. For a moment, the fingers of the corpse sprang slightly, like a child reluctant to give up a toy. Then they relaxed again into their final emptiness. Whimsy unfolded the paper. It was not new. The edges were softened, as though it had been carried for some time. The ink was faded to a brownish gray, and the handwriting, thin, slanting, precise, had that particular clipped elegance of the interwar-educated classes. Letters formed with discipline, but with just enough flourish to imply personality. At the top, there was a date. 31st October, 1937. Below it, a few lines, written as if in haste but without panic. "If you are reading this, I am already gone. Do not believe the clocks. Ask about the key that was not lost." L.D. Parker stared. Denton swore under his breath. Even Mrs. Craddock, who had followed them in despite the constable's attempt to bar her, made a small sound like a spoon dropped on stone. Whimsy looked at the note again, and then, very slowly, lifted his gaze to the room full of ticking and silence. "Lionel Darracott," he said. Denton's voice was rough. "Sir Lionel, but this is impossible. That note was written in 1937, said Whimsy. "Yes, and yet our modern corpse appears to have taken the trouble to hold it while being struck to death, which suggests either an unusually literary murderer or a victim who thought, at the last moment, that the past had reached up and seized him by the ankle. Parker took the paper carefully from Whimsy's tweezers and held it nearer to the window light. "It could be a forgery," he said. "It could," Whimsy agreed, "but it has the smell of truth." "What do you mean, smell?" demanded Denton. Whimsy's nostrils flared faintly, as though he were indeed sampling the air like a wine. "Old paper has a particular scent," he said, "and so does old fear. And this room, Inspector, has not merely been the scene of a death, it has been waiting for one." He stood, brushing his hands as though time itself were dust. "Now," he went on lightly, "let us meet Mr. Jasper Darracott, who owns this admirable museum of mortality. And after that, I should like, quite terribly, to know what became of a key that was not lost." As they left the clock room, the living clock in the Rococo case continued its patient swing. Its pendulum moved with the measured indifference of a heart that will go on beating long after manners, money, and men have stopped. And somewhere in the Grange, unseen but perfectly present, the year 1937, like a ghost with good handwriting, waited to be understood. Mr. Jasper Darracott received them in the library with the air of a man who has inherited not merely a house, but a system of obligations, and is perpetually conscious that the roof, the servants, the lawns, and the very books on the shelves have opinions about his conduct. He was a lean, well-groomed person of 40-something, with a narrow face and a mouth that looked as though it had once been trained to smile and had since forgotten the trick. A decanter and 2 glasses stood on a table near his elbow, like props awaiting their cue. "I've told Inspector Denton everything," he said, before anybody had asked him anything at all. His voice was steady, but his fingers worried the rim of the glass in a small repetitive movement, an unconscious polishing gesture, as though he hoped to make the whole business shine itself away. "As you will have the goodness to tell us again," said Parker with professional gentleness. Whimsy, however, had turned aside to contemplate the library's fireplace, where an arrangement of late roses, bruised by season and central heating, attempted a final prettiness. He leaned forward, not so much admiring as observing, and then, without turning his head, said, "Do you keep a dog, Mr. Darracott?" Darracott blinked. "No. Why?" "Pity," said Whimsy. "A dog is so useful. It barks at strangers, and it does not tell lies. Proceed, Charles." Darracott drew in a breath. "Adrian Whelpdale came down from town yesterday afternoon. He was to go over some papers with me. There's been business, an estate matter. I've had to consider selling a portion of the collection." Mrs. Craddock made a sound like a cupboard door closing. Darracott's nostrils flared. "To pay certain demands," he finished stiffly. "Whelpdale had the correspondence. He arrived at 4. We took tea. We worked until nearly 7. Then he said he'd like to see the clock room." "And you," said Denton, "took him there." "Yes. I show it to people. There's nothing secret about it." The words came out too quickly, like a rehearsed line delivered before the prompter could change his mind. He was interested. He asked questions. He seemed excited. He said he'd read about Sir Lionel. Whimsy's gaze moved at last from the roses to a portrait on the wall, a heavy-jowled gentleman in late Victorian whiskers, staring out as though he were judging the entire 20th century for its lack of stamina. "Sir Lionel's nephew," Whimsy murmured. "And successor. Did Sir Lionel ever show excitement, I wonder? Or did he merely collect it in other people?" Parker ignored him. "What time did you leave the clock room?" "About 7:15. Perhaps 20 past. I can't be exact." "Why not?" Because the clocks—" Darracott made a helpless gesture. "None of them agree. I don't consult them. I have my watch." "And your watch," said Whimsy brightly. Darracott looked at him as one looks at a man who has begun to sing in church. "I don't know." In my dressing room, probably. Whimsy nodded, as if this were the most natural answer in the world. One must never trust time to be where one left it. Denton leaned forward. What happened after you left Mr. Whelpdale? I went to the dining room. Mrs. Craddock had dinner laid, just for me. Adrian said he would join me. He didn't. I assumed he'd gone back to his room. Which room? Parker asked. So the blue room. East wing. And when did you see him again? Darracot's mouth tightened. This morning. When Mrs. Craddock... He stopped, and his eyes flicked towards the housekeeper with an odd mixture of resentment and dependence. Mrs. Craddock spoke because she could not bear other people's fumbling. I went to call Mr. Whelpdale at 8:30, she said. He was not in his room. I assumed he'd gone down early to see Mr. Darracot. When he did not appear, I sent Evans. She nodded towards the door where the constable waited. To look. Evans found him in the clock room. And the door, said Denton. It was shut, said Mrs. Craddock. Not locked. We do not lock it. There is no need. No need, repeated Whimsy softly. He had wandered to a side table and picked up a silver-framed photograph. Modern, glossy. It was showing Darracot with a handsome woman and 2 children on what looked like a seaside holiday. Whimsy examined it with a kind of gentle curiosity, as though it were a dead beetle pinned to card. Mrs. Darracot is not at home? Darracot's eyes hardened. My wife is in Bournemouth, with the children. My mother is with her. The heir agrees with them. And does it agree with you? That's irrelevant. Nearly everything is irrelevant, said Whimsy cheerfully. Until it isn't. Parker returned to the note. Mr. Darracot, do you know anything about this paper, dated 31st of October, 1937, signed L.D.? Darracot's face changed. Only a little, but enough. A tightening around the eyes, the sudden draining of color from the mouth. It was the expression of a man who has been told, unexpectedly, that a childhood sin has been remembered. I know, he said. But it must be some trick, some morbid joke. Whimsy put the photograph down with elaborate care. A morbid joke, he echoed. In a room where a man hanged himself, and where another man has now been bashed into eternity clutching a message from the dead. Yes, one sees the humor. Darracot's voice rose. Sir Lionel was ill, unbalanced. Everybody knows that. Everybody, said Whimsy, knows a great many things which are extremely convenient. Denton cleared his throat. There's something else, Mr. Darracot. Your secretary's pockets. He had a key on him. Darracot stared. A key? A little brass key, said Denton. Plain, old-fashioned. Not the sort you'd carry for a modern Yale lock. Whimsy's eyes brightened. Not with delight, but with that quick, predatory interest which comes when a meaningless object moves 1 inch closer to meaning. And what did it fit? Parker asked. We haven't found out yet, said Denton, but it was clenched in his coat pocket like he didn't want to lose it. Whimsy lifted a finger. Ah, the key that was not lost. He turned to Darracot. Tell me, do you keep any keys in a special place? A hook? A drawer? A little leather bag labeled in your own handwriting? Darracot's jaw worked. For a moment he looked very tired, like a man who has carried a secret for so long that he has forgotten whether it is shameful or merely heavy. There used to be, he said at last in a low voice. The key. Sir Lionel kept it. He said it was for something important. After his death it was mislaid. Mislaid, repeated Whimsy. How admirably passive, as though keys simply wander off in the night to pursue their own careers. It was lost, snapped Darracot. We searched. It was never found. And yet, said Whimsy, our dead Mr. Whelpdale has arrived with a key in his pocket and a note telling us not to believe the clocks. Inspector Denton, I should like very much to see where Sir Lionel kept his key before we do anything so vulgar as to find out what this one opens. Parker looked at him sharply. "Peter, why?" Whimsy's smile was light, almost absent-minded. "Because," he said, "when a house says no need about locks, it generally means there is a need so old and so intimate that nobody dares to name it aloud." Whimsy insisted, politely of course, and with that air of being indulgent to other people's preference for linear thought, upon visiting the place where Sir Lionel's key had been mislaid before anybody was permitted to do anything as vulgar as try keys in locks. Denton, who had the weary expression of a man watching a cat stroll about a fishmonger's stall, conducted them upstairs to Sir Lionel's old suite. The east wing had the particular chill of unused rooms, a cold that was not merely temperature but disapproval. Here and there, white dust sheets humped over furniture like patient ghosts that had taken up knitting. Their footsteps sounded oddly hollow, as though the house were listening from within its own bones. "This," said Denton, pushing open a door, "was Sir Lionel's dressing room. The key, Mrs. Craddock says, was kept in there." Mrs. Craddock followed in, rigid with propriety, as though she suspected the very wallpaper of indecency. She went straight to an old oak chest of drawers, with brass handles dulled by decades of fingers. "Third drawer," she said. "A little tray. Tony used to drop it in there of a night, like a man dropping a coin in a poor box. For safety," he said. "And then," said Whimsy, "after he died, the drawer was opened and the tray was empty, and everyone said, 'How very odd,' and that was the end of it." Darracott, who had been dragged along in spite of himself, said sharply, "We searched the whole room." "Searches are very emotional things," said Whimsy. "They involve a great deal of turning out and very little of seeing. May I?" He opened the drawer. It contained, neatly arranged, the unremarkable remains of Sir Lionel's routine: a cracked tortoise-shell comb, a pair of cufflinks in a little morocco box, a brush with the Darracott crest. At one corner lay a shallow wooden tray, empty. Whimsy did not stare into the tray as though expecting it to bloom into revelation. He inspected the drawer itself, the runners, the corners, the underside of the tray. He lifted the tray and set it aside, then ran his fingers along the bottom of the drawer, not like a thief, but like a pianist testing a keyboard. "Mr. Parker," he said, "if you will be so good as to look at the left rear corner." Parker leaned in. "There's a mark." "Aha," said Whimsy. "A little crescent of brighter wood, as though something small and metallic sat there for a long time and was removed at last. A key, perhaps, or perhaps a ring of keys, and you will observe—" "No dust," Denton snorted. "Mrs. Craddock cleans." "She does," said Whimsy with sincere admiration. "But even the most devoted housekeeper cannot polish away time itself. Dust is the house's own handwriting. Now, and this drawer has a sentence in it which has been erased with uncommon care." Mrs. Craddock's face was blank with offended virtue. "I never touched Sir Lionel's personal things without leave." "I have no doubt," said Whimsy pleasantly. "If I suggested otherwise, I should deserve to be struck with a long-case clock." He stepped back and looked, not at the drawer, but at the room, the dressing table with its mirror, the wardrobe, the faded rug. His gaze paused on the fireplace. A little pile of ash lay there, grey and soft, like the remains of some minor sacrament. "Do you ever light fires in here?" he asked. "No," said Mrs. Craddock at once. "Not since—" "Since 1937, supplied Whimsy. "No, of course, but someone has." Denton strode to the grate and peered. "That could be old." Whimsy's voice remained mild. "Old ash does not sit on top of new soot. Also it smells, faintly, of paper. Not wood, not coal." Darracott's hands clenched. "What are you implying?" "I never imply," said Whimsy. "It is a lazy habit. I observe. And what I observe is that somebody has burned something in this room within the last few days, something that went quickly and left little behind. Such as, a letter, a note, a piece of paper that one did not wish to keep. Parker's eyes sharpened. The 1937 note? That note, said Whimsy, was not burned. He turned on his heel and walked out as though bored. They followed him down the corridor, through the cold hush of the wing, and back towards the heart of the house. Denton muttered to Parker, "He's playing games." Parker said quietly, "He's not. He's listening." They reached the landing where the corridor turned toward the clock room. Whimsy halted there as suddenly as if he had run into an invisible wire. "Inspector," he said, "how far is it from the clock room to the dining room?" Denton frowned. "What's that got to do?" "Indulge my bad habits," said Whimsy. "From the door of the clock room to the dining room sideboard." Denton, still frowning, led the way. The distance was not great. Down the corridor, past the hall, through a pair of doors into the dining room. "About 40 yards, said Denton. 40, said Whimsy. "And how thick is the clock room door?" "A heavy thing, oak." "Soundproof?" Whimsy asked. Denton hesitated. "It's solid." "Everything is solid until it is inconvenient," said Whimsy. "Now, Mr. Darracott, when you left Mr. Whelpdale in the clock room at, say, 7:20, you went to dine. Did you hear anything?" Darracott swallowed. "No." "No thud," said Whimsy. "No cry, no clock chiming, no sudden quarrel, no running footsteps." "I heard nothing," said Darracott too quickly. Whimsy's gaze slid to Mrs. Craddock. "And you, Mrs. Craddock, where were you at the time?" "In the pantry," she said, "with cook, preparing dinner." "Did you hear anything unusual?" Whimsy asked. "No, my lord." Whimsy smiled faintly, as if the title were an accidental pin someone had stuck into him. "Then either Mr. Whelpdale was killed very quietly indeed, or he was killed when nobody who was awake was in a position to hear him." Parker said, "That suggests later." "Or earlier," said Whimsy. Denton's patience snapped, "But Darracott says he was alive at 7:20. Whimsy looked at him with gentle reproach. "Oh, Inspector, dear fellow, Mr. Darracott has said a great many things. He has also said he cannot be exact because the clocks do not agree. And we have been specifically told by a dead man in 1937 not to believe the clocks." They had returned by a kind of conversational gravity to the hall. The grandfather clock there, the respectable sort that keeps company with umbrellas, ticked with ostentatious honesty. Whimsy walked to it, took out his own watch at last, and compared them. 2 minutes slow," he murmured, and then looked up at the stairs. How very human, always just behind. A maid stood at the foot of the stairs, hovering like a guilty thought. She was young, with reddened eyes and hands clasped in front of her apron as though praying for invisibility. "This," said Mrs. Craddock, with the tone of presenting evidence, "so is Ivy Cattermole. She helps in the house." Whimsy's manner altered, softened without losing its edge. "Miss Cattermole," he said, "you have been remarkably quiet. Quiet people often know most. Would you be so kind as to tell me, did Mr. Whelpdale speak to you yesterday evening?" The girl flinched. No, my lord." "Think," said Whimsy. "Not speak, gesture. Ask for something, drop something, anything that made you notice him." Her eyes darted to Mrs. Craddock, then to Denton, then, desperately, to Parker, as though he might rescue her by being merely official. At last she whispered, "He asked me about the bells." "The bells?" said Parker. "The church bells," she stammered. He said, do they ring at 12:30? And I said, not unless there's a funeral, sir. And he laughed, sort of." Whimsy's expression became intent. Why 12:30, do you suppose?" The maid swallowed. "Because that's when they say Sir Lionel walks, when the clocks strike wrong." Denton made an impatient sound. "Village nonsense." Whimsy's eyes remained on the girl. "And then what happened, Miss Cattermole?" He asked If the clock room had a bell, like a servant's bell, to call someone. She twisted her apron. And I said there's the old bell pull, but it don't ring nowhere now. Not since the wires were taken out. Whimsy turned his head very slowly towards Denton, and there was a sudden change in the room's atmosphere, like a draught finding a crack. A bell pull, he said softly. Disconnected. Taken out. Not since. When, Mrs. Craddock? Mrs. Craddock's mouth tightened to a line. Not since before my time. Which, said Whimsy, is always the most convenient period in history. He looked down at his hands, as though contemplating their uselessness in a world that kept removing its own mechanisms. Then he said lightly, Now, Inspector, may we see this modern key? And may we, very gently, discover what in this house still answers when called? Denton produced the key from an envelope with the reverence of a man handling something that might, if jarred, explode into paperwork. It was indeed plain. A small brass thing, worn smooth on the bow, its bit old-fashioned and neatly cut. Whimsy took it, not in his fingers, but on the corner of the envelope, as though even a modest key deserved the decencies of non-contamination. A key that has been used, he observed, used often enough to acquire that soft shine of habit. Not a thing newly bought to fit a brand-new wickedness. Denton grunted. We'll have the locksmith. Oh, by all means, said Whimsy. But first let us do what Sir Lionel would have done. Let us ask the house. Houses are the most talkative creatures alive. They will tell you everything if you know which cupboard to open. He walked back towards the clock room with the air of a man going to visit an acquaintance who had recently embarrassed itself in public. Parker followed, notebook ready. Denton followed because he could not very well arrest a peer of the realm for being irritating. Mrs. Craddock came after them with the stiff persistence of a moral principle. Ivy Cattermole lingered at the foot of the stairs, torn between curiosity and terror, until Whimsy glanced back and said, as though inviting her to a tea party, Come along. Oh, Miss Cattermole, if there are bells, we may require someone who knows how to be startled properly. The clock room greeted them with its dense chorus of ticks and the inert, watchful faces of stopped dials. The body had been removed now, decently covered and taken away, leaving behind only the faintly darker stain on the parquet and the sense, more oppressive than any corpse, that something had been decided here. Whimsy stood a moment at the threshold. Inspector, he said, when your constable found Mr. Whelpdale, did he mention anything at all about the arrangement of the room? A clock moved, a chair displaced? Nothing, said Denton. It was tidy enough. Too tidy, maybe. Ah, said Whimsy. The most suspicious word in the language is tidy. He moved to the walls, looking not at the clock's faces, but behind them, and along the skirting board, into corners where a conscientious housekeeper's brush might or might not have ventured. He paused by the window, lifted the curtain a fraction, and looked down at the sill. A fine, he remarked conversationally, gritty little line. Dust and, yes, metal filings. Parker looked up sharply. From the key? Possibly from a lock, Whimsy replied, or from a clock case. Brass against brass. One does not obtain filings from polite conversation. He turned his attention to the Rococo clock, the one still running, and watched the pendulum swing with a kind of dreamy absorption. Tell me, he said to Ivy, when Mr. Whelpdale asked you about the bell pull, did he say why? She shook her head. No, my lord. He only said, it's odd in a room like that, not to have a way to call. And I said, it's an old room, it's got old things. And then, said Whimsy, he laughed. Yes. Whimsy nodded, as though that laughter had been a datum of the first importance. Inspector Denton, where is the bell pull? Denton pointed. There, by the door. It was a length of braided cord, faded and fraying, hanging from a little brass plate. Whimsy did not pull it. He merely examined the plate, the cord, the point where it entered the wall. A survivor, he murmured. "It has been allowed to remain because it is harmless, which is exactly what one says of a good many people." He produced a small penknife and, with a delicacy that made it look like a surgeon's instrument, loosened the brass plate. Behind it there was a cavity, dusty, cobwebbed, and empty of mechanism. Yet on the plaster edge, a darker smear showed where something had once rubbed. "Wires removed," said Parker. "Removed," said Whimsy. "Cut, I fancy. Not unscrewed. One sees a certain impatience in the method." Denton said irritably, "What of it? It doesn't ring. The girl said so." Whimsy replaced the plate without fastening it fully. "Let us try the key," he said. "On what?" demanded Denton. "We don't know what it opens." Whimsy turned and, with a gesture as casual as a man choosing a book, indicated the great long case against the north wall, the one with the moon-phase dial. "I should like to wager," he said, a moderately good cigar, that Sir Lionel's important key did not open a cupboard full of jam. Mrs. Craddock drew herself up. "That clock is not to be touched. Mr. Darracot is not here," said Whimsy gently, "and we are. Besides, Mrs. Craddock, if you wish to preserve it, you must allow us to discover what has been done to it." He knelt and examined the base. Most long cases have a simple door to access the weights and pendulum. This one had that, but also Whimsy's fingers found it with the ease of long practice. A second seam, so fine it might have been part of the grain. A panel, flush with the wood, with a tiny keyhole cunningly placed within a carved leaf. "There," he said softly, "a secret that pretends not to exist. How very English." Denton's eyes narrowed. "You're guessing." "I am," said Whimsy, "but it is a cultivated guess, the sort that grows in the mind after too many hours spent with liars." He inserted the brass key. It turned, smoothly and without protest, with the sound of old metal consenting to an old acquaintance. Parker exhaled. Denton swore, quite reverently. Whimsy opened the concealed panel. It swung out on hidden hinges, revealing a shallow compartment. There was no jewel box, no bundle of letters tied with ribbon, no melodramatic skull, only a small object of utilitarian ugliness. A telephone receiver, black, old-fashioned, and beside it a little crank handle and a tangle of cloth-covered wire running into the wall like a severed vein. "A private line," said Parker. "Hidden." "Hidden," said Whimsy, "and therefore valuable." Denton leaned in. "But there's no dial." "It's not for the exchange," said Whimsy. "It's an internal system. House to somewhere, a room, a lodge, a servant's corridor, a bell pull replaced by a voice." Whimsy lifted the receiver. He did not put it to his ear at once. He held it as though it were a dead bird, weighing its significance. "Miss Cattermole," he said, you told us the bell wires were taken out, but perhaps, being modern, they were replaced." He put the receiver to his ear. For a moment there was nothing but a faint, sour silence, like a line that has not been used in years and resents being remembered. Then, abruptly, a thin click, and after that, a low, intermittent sound. Tick, tick, tick. Whimsy's eyes moved to the clocks around him. His mouth twitched. "The house," he said quietly, "keeps its own time." Denton snapped, "Is that a person on the line?" Whimsy's expression remained almost amused, but his voice altered, became brisker, more precise. "No," he said, "not a person, a mechanism. Listen." He held the receiver out. Parker took it and listened, frowning. Denton listened next, impatience shifting into unease. "It's like," Denton began. "A tapping," said Ivy, but in a frightened whisper. "Like when the clocks, when they go wrong." Whimsy took the receiver back. "Exactly. Now, Inspector, imagine a clever man shut in this room, frightened, injured perhaps, but clever, discovering that there is a hidden telephone inside a clock, and that when he lifts it, he hears only ticking. What would he do? Parker said slowly. He'd look for the other end. And, said Whimsy, if he had a key and a note telling him not to believe the clocks, he might already suspect where the other end was. He might even have arranged to meet it. Denton's face darkened. You think Whelpdale found this and someone followed him in? I think, said Whimsy, that Mr. Whelpdale came here for something, and once he had it, or thought he had it, he ceased to be a secretary and became an inconvenience. He set the receiver down carefully. His eyes traveled to the wire disappearing into the wall. Now, he said, we must find where this leads, and we must do it without asking the house's permission, because the house has had nearly 90 years to learn how to keep a secret. He straightened, brushing a speck of dust from his cuff as if it had insulted him. And before we go tugging at wires like infants unraveling a sweater, he added lightly, we shall pay a visit to the one person in this establishment who has been before her time for far too long. Mrs. Craddock's face had gone a shade paler beneath its propriety. Whimsy looked at her with mild, devastating courtesy. Mrs. Craddock, he said, tell me who exactly was housekeeper here in 1937? Mrs. Craddock's chin lifted a fraction, as though Whimsy had attempted to pry open a locked drawer with his fingernail. So she looked past him, to Inspector Denton, to Parker, anywhere but directly at the question, as if hoping that some official regulation might be produced to forbid inquiries into the year 1937. I cannot say, she replied at last. It was before my time. Whimsy's tone remained delightfully reasonable. Yes, you said so. But before my time is a curious phrase, Mrs. Craddock. It suggests a period in which clocks stopped, bells were disconnected, telephones hidden inside furniture, and nobody was responsible for anything. One almost expects the parish register to read, born before my time, married before my time, died before my time. Denton made an impatient movement. Look here. I beg your pardon, Inspector. I was brought up to look everywhere. Whimsy's eyes rested, gently but with a kind of implacable patience, on Mrs. Craddock's face. Now, I'm not asking you to accuse anybody. I'm asking you for a name. Who ran this house when Sir Lionel died? Mrs. Craddock's lips pressed together. For 1 second she looked oddly weary, like a woman who has spent 30 years preventing other people from making messes and has discovered that some messes were made long ago and cannot be scrubbed away. At that time, she said, the housekeeper was Mrs. Elspeth Marr. Marr, repeated Whimsy, as though tasting the syllable. A good solid word. Scottish, perhaps. She was from Aberdeen, said Mrs. Craddock sharply, and then, as if she had betrayed too much, added, she is dead. How obliging of her, said Whimsy. People have such a habit of dying just when they might be useful. Parker wrote it down. Did Mrs. Marr leave? Family? A daughter? A niece? Somebody who might remember? Mrs. Craddock's hand tightened on the edge of her apron. She had a niece, Annie Marr. She came sometimes, helped with sewing. Whimsy's voice stayed light, and Annie Marr, also dead. No, snapped Mrs. Craddock. Annie Marr married. Annie Kedge now. She keeps the post office at Little Fenchurch. Splendid, said Whimsy. A woman who keeps a post office keeps everybody's secrets by day and sells stamps by night. We shall pay her our respects presently. Denton's brow furrowed. This is all very interesting, my lord, but we've a murder on our hands. Whelpdale, not Sir Lionel. Indeed, said Whimsy, but Whelpdale has thoughtfully arrived clutching Sir Lionel's handwriting. If you will forgive the metaphor, Inspector, the corpse is lying on top of an older corpse, and it would be unscientific to pretend the lower one is not there. He crossed to the long case clock and, with the careful air of a man handling a rare book, reopened the concealed panel. The black receiver sat in its shallow cavity like an insect in amber. This line, he said, was not installed yesterday. Look at the cloth-covered wire. Look at the workmanship. It has that pre-war earnestness. Somebody in 1937, or thereabouts, decided to create a private communication system. Then somebody later removed the bell wires, but left this. Denton asked, "Why leave it?" "Because," said Whimsy, "you cannot remove a secret if you are still using it." Mrs. Craddock's face had taken on that polished blankness which good servants acquire when gentlemen begin theorizing in front of them. Yet Whimsy's eyes kept returning to her, and as though she were a clock face whose hands had moved a shade too far. "Mrs. Craddock," he said, "how long have you been in service at Rookwood Grange?" 22 years, she replied at once, too promptly. "And before that?" "I was housekeeper at Dean's Court in Suffolk." "Do you happen," said Whimsy, "to have known Mrs. Elspeth Marr?" Mrs. Craddock's eyelids flickered. "No." Whimsy nodded as though accepting it. "Of course not. My mistake. Merely a fancy of mine. One is so prone to imagine that housekeepers know other housekeepers as clergymen know other clergymen. By reputation, by instinct, by the smell of polish." He closed the panel. "Now, Inspector Denton, where is Mr. Darracott?" "In the library, with a constable." "Then let us bother him again," said Whimsy cheerfully. "He has the air of a man who has been bothered all his life, and it would be a pity to break with tradition." They found Darracott sitting rigidly in an armchair, as though braced against being struck. His eyes went at once to Whimsy's hands, an anxious glance, like a miser checking whether his visitor carries a match. Whimsy did not sit. He stood by the mantelpiece and addressed Darracott with the friendly candor of a man discussing the weather. "Mr. Darracott, you told us you left Mr. Whelpdale in the clock-room at about 7:20, and then you dined. Did you ring for coffee? Did anyone come in? Did you speak to anyone at all between 7:20 and, let us say, 9? Darracott swallowed. Mrs. Craddock came in. "To serve." "At what time?" After 8. I don't know precisely." "Your watch again," murmured Whimsy. "It leads a lonely life." Denton snapped. "So we can check the kitchen staff." "Precisely," said Whimsy, unruffled. "We can check the habits of servants, which are as reliable as tides, unless someone has taken the trouble to alter them." Parker said quietly, "Mr. Darracott, did Whelpdale have access to Sir Lionel's papers?" Darracott's jaw tightened. "He had access to anything I gave him." "And did you give him," asked Whimsy, "anything connected with 1937? "No, not even," said Whimsy. "An old diary, a memorandum, a packet of letters, a key that was not lost?" Darracott half rose, colour rushing up into his face. "This is absurd. My uncle killed himself. There was an inquest. There was nothing mysterious." "Oh, but there was," said Whimsy softly. "There always is, when somebody leaves behind a message saying, 'Do not believe the clocks.' And that is not the phrase of a man who is merely unbalanced. It is the phrase of a man who is being, how shall I put it, organized." Darracott stared at him. "Organized?" "Arranged," said Whimsy. "Managed. Nudged into a conclusion that suited someone else. Like Mr. Whelpdale, perhaps?" For a moment there was a silence so complete that the library clock, an honest little thing with a modest tick, seemed indecently loud. Then Darracott said, very low, "If you're suggesting I killed him—" "I'm suggesting nothing," said Whimsy. "I'm asking you to remember, because you're not merely a man with a corpse in his house. You're a man with a history in his walls, and histories have a habit of demanding interest." Denton broke in, brusque. "We've had reports from the village already. Talk of ghosts, talk of Sir Lionel walking again. Superstition. But it stirs people up. Did Whelpdale speak to anyone in the village? Did he go out after dinner?" Darracott hesitated. Whimsy's head tilted a fraction. "Ah," he said. "There it is. The small pause where the truth sits down and waits to be noticed." Darracott's eyes shifted. He went out. For a little. After dinner. He said he wanted air. Alone? Asked Parker. I assumed so. What time? Denton demanded. 9-ish. Whimsy's voice was amiable. And when did he return? I didn't see him return. So, said Whimsy, your secretary, carrying a key he was anxious not to lose, and possessing, or seeking, a note written by your dead uncle, went out into a village full of ghost stories at 9 o'clock in the evening, and came back unseen to a clock room containing a hidden telephone that answers only with ticking. He looked at Parker. Well, dear Charles, I think we ought to go to Little Fenchurch. Then, as if it were an afterthought, he added, Inspector Denton, do you have anyone stationed at the lodge? The lodge? Denton frowned. It's empty. Is it? Said Whimsy, and his tone for the first time carried a faint, dangerous edge. Empty in the way the bell pull is empty, or empty in the way a cupboard is empty, because someone has just removed what was inside. Denton stared at him. Whimsy put on his gloves with meticulous care, as though sealing his hands against the house. Because, he finished lightly, if that hidden line has an end point, it is likely to be somewhere small, overlooked, and officially not used. And those are precisely the places in which the living hide, is when they wish to be mistaken for ghosts. They drove to Little Fenchurch in a drizzle that behaved as though it had been instructed to look innocuous while taking notes. The village lay in a shallow fold of land, its houses clustered about the church like sheep about a shepherd who had mislaid his crook. It possessed that curious air of modest antiquity which is so often the mask of small, persistent modernities. New wireless aerials sprouted from old roofs, the butcher's shop displayed tinned peaches beside the joints, and the inn, with a name as pious as The Angel, advertised in chalk, a darts match tonight, visitors welcome. The post office was also the village shop. Its windows were packed with stationery, biscuits, and cheap toys, all arranged in that restless disorder which suggests a mind capable of knowing precisely where everything is. Over the door, a bell tinkled, a bell that, unlike the one in the clock room, was honestly connected to something. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s, broad-shouldered and brisk, her hair drawn back in a bun with the uncompromising exactness of one who ties up not only hair, but also facts. Her eyes, pale and direct, took in Parker's plainness and Denton's official set, then rested on Whimsy with a flicker that might have been amusement or recognition. Afternoon, she said. You'll be wanting stamps or trouble. Both, if you have them, said Whimsy. Mrs. Kedge, I presume? And who might you be? She asked, not rudely. But with the right of a woman who has spent her life being underestimated and has made a steady profit from it. Lord Peter Whimsy, said Whimsy, with the air of producing a visiting card that he personally found a little ridiculous. This is Mr. Parker of Scotland Yard, and Inspector Denton. We have come about the late Mr. Whelpdale. Her face altered, only by a shade, the tightening of the skin at the mouth. She did not make the sentimental village noises of surprise. She merely nodded once, like a person checking off an item she had suspected might arrive. So, she said, it's happened. Parker leaned forward. You knew him? Knew of him, she replied. He was about the Grange yesterday, came in here, bought a postcard, one of them silly ones with the church on it, and asked questions. Questions about what? Asked Denton. About time, she said, and there was the faintest hint of contempt in her voice, as though time was something young men asked about when they had nothing better to do. About the bells, about Sir Lionel, about the clock room. Same as all the rest that come fishing, only he weren't fishing for a story. Whimsy's tone was conversational. How do you know? Because he paid, she said bluntly. Not for stamps, for information. 2 shillings for my trouble and another 2 when I didn't laugh. Denton said sharply, What information did you give him? She looked at Denton as though he were a boy asking how milk arrives in the bottle. "I told him what everybody knows and nobody says in front of Mr. Jasper." "And that is?" prompted Parker. "That Sir Lionel didn't hang himself," she said. "Not the way they said. Shown he was frightened to death first, and then he was hung up like a rabbit." Parker's pencil paused. Denton swore softly. Whimsy, however, did not react theatrically. He only regarded her with a kind of gentle attentiveness, as though she were a witness in an old case he had always meant to reopen. "Mrs. Kedge," he said, "that is a serious statement." "It's a village statement," she returned. "Serious enough if you live with it. You London gentlemen can call it gossip and go home. We had to go on walking past that house with its windows shut and its clock stopped and pretend it was all proper." Parker said, "On what do you base it?" She reached under the counter and produced, not a document, but a tin of biscuits, placed it firmly on the glass top, and leaned her forearms upon it as though preparing to wrestle. "On Mrs. Marr," she said. "Ede, my aunt. She was housekeeper there, and she came home that night white as a sheet, shaking like she'd been out in frost without her coat. She sat in our kitchen and said, 'Annie, if anybody asks, you say Sir Lionel was alone.' And I said, 'Why would anybody ask?' And she said, 'Because they'll want it neat.'" Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "Neat, like Inspector Denton's tidy." Mrs. Kedge nodded once. "Aye, neat. Then she burned something in our grate. Wouldn't let me see. Kept poking it down with the tongs like she was killing it twice." Parker said carefully, "Did she tell you what she burned?" "No, but she told me what she saw." "And what did she see?" asked Whimsy. Mrs. Kedge hesitated, and for the first time her briskness faltered into something like reluctance, an old, sour reluctance that had lived too long in the mind. She said, "Mrs. Kedge began, that Sir Lionel was in the clock room with someone, not Mr. Jasper. He was only a young lad then, off at school. Someone else, a man from London," she said, "a gentleman, and Sir Lionel was begging." "Begging," Parker repeated. "Begging him to stop," said Mrs. Kedge. "Begging him not to make him do it. And the other man, he laughed, same as that secretary laughed from what Ivy said. Laughed like it was all a game." Whimsy's voice was very soft. "Did your aunt say anything about a key?" Mrs. Kedge's eyes sharpened. "Yes, the key. Sir Lionel had it in his hand. He wouldn't let it go, like it was the one solid thing left. Mrs. Marr said the man tried to take it and Sir Lionel screamed proper, like an animal, and then the man struck him." Denton's face darkened. "With what?" Mrs. Kedge shrugged. "A clock weight, maybe. Something heavy. Mrs. Marr didn't stay to measure. She ran out, said she heard the clocks going mad behind her, striking when they shouldn't, chiming out of turn like they were mocking him." Whimsy's gaze lifted, briefly, as though he could see the interior of the Grange through the miles of wet hedgerow. "Do not believe the clocks," he murmured. Parker said, "Why didn't Mrs. Marr go to the police?" Mrs. Kedge gave a short laugh without mirth. "Police? In 1937, with Sir Lionel a baronet and a gentleman from London, and my aunt a servant. She'd have been turned inside out like a pocket and left to dry. She did what servants do. She kept the house standing." Whimsy said gently, "And afterward, what became of the key?" Mrs. Kedge's hands tightened. "That's the thing. After Sir Lionel was found, they all said he'd locked himself in, but Mrs. Marr knew he hadn't. She said there was a key, an extra key, one Sir Lionel kept for the hidden door in the big moon clock. She said the gentleman took it." "And did your aunt ever say the gentleman's name?" Parker asked. "No," said Mrs. Kedge. "Only that he had gloves like a doctor and a voice like a vicar when he was lying, and that he told her, afterwards in the corridor, quiet as you please, that if she valued her place, she'd remember nothing but her duties." Whimsy's eyes flicked to Denton. A very practical kind of haunting. Denton said grimly, "And Whelpdale, what did he do with this tale?" "He wrote something down," said Mrs. Kedge. "In a little book. He asked about the lodge, too." Whimsy's head lifted. "The lodge?" "Aye," she said. "He said, 'Is it truly empty?' And I said, 'Empty enough for ghosts.' And he said—" She paused, and frowning with the effort of exact recall, "He said, 'Then the ghost has a telephone.'" Parker stared at her. "He said that." "I heard what I heard," said Mrs. Kedge stubbornly. Whimsy exhaled softly through his nose, a sound that might have been amusement in another context, but here was closer to anger held in leash. "Mrs. Kedge," he said, "did anyone else speak to Mr. Whelpdale yesterday evening? Anyone see him after dark?" She nodded. "Old Tom Sallows did, the one that keeps bees by the churchyard. Tom said Whelpdale was standing by the lich gate near 10, looking up at the bell tower like he expected it to answer him, and Tom said he weren't alone. There was someone across the road in the shadow of the yews. Watching." "Description," Denton snapped. Mrs. Kedge shook her head. "Tom's eyes are half honey these days. He only said tall, hat, and that the man didn't move like a villager. Moved like he belonged to the house." Whimsy's voice remained mild, but there was now a hard clarity beneath it, like steel under velvet. "A man who belonged to the house," he said, "and a lodge that is empty. Inspector Denton, I think we are in danger of being outpaced by our own assumptions. The murderer is not obliged to be modern merely because the corpse is." He turned to Mrs. Kedge and, with sudden warmth, said, "You have been very helpful. 2 shillings was disgracefully inadequate." He placed a note on the counter, more than generous but not ostentatious, as though he were paying not for gossip but for courage. Mrs. Kedge glanced at it and said shortly, "You won't thank me if it turns ugly." "It already has," said Whimsy. They went out into the drizzle. The church bells, and above the grey roofs, were silent, waiting for whatever human hand decided they ought to speak. At the gate, Whimsy paused and looked back along the village street, where wet cobbles reflected the shop windows like dark glass. "Charles," he said softly, "we have a double life, not of Sir Lionel, of the house. One face for visitors, and one for its own private conversations." Parker said, "You think the lodge is the other end of the line?" "I think," said Whimsy, "that Mr. Whelpdale thought so. And if he went there with a key and a note and the confidence of a young man who believes that knowledge is armor, he may have discovered, too late, that the past does not merely leave messages. It answers them." Denton's jaw set. "We'll put men on the lodge." Whimsy nodded. "Yes," he said, "and we shall go ourselves, quietly. Because if someone has been living in the margins of this house for years, he will not be frightened by policemen. But he may be frightened by one thing only, the sound of his own secret telephone beginning, at last, to ring." They went to the lodge at dusk, because lodges are made for dusk. They look most plausible then, when one can pretend that a small, separate building is merely picturesque, and not, as it so often is, an excuse. The drive ran between clipped yews that had grown into shapes resembling solemn, badly shaven men. Beyond them, the Grange watched through its tall windows with the blank patience of a face in a portrait. Denton had posted 2 constables at a discreet distance. Discreet, that is, to anybody who did not live in the village and know exactly which hedge concealed which pair of boots. Whimsy approved of the arrangement with that airy gratitude which in other men might have meant compliance, but in him only meant that he had noticed it and would use it as he pleased. The lodge itself stood by the gate, a low brick and timber affair with a small porch and a leaded window. It looked, in the failing light, perfectly empty. Empty as a stage looks before the curtain rises. "Locked," said Denton, trying the door. "Everything is locked," said Whimsy, "until someone wants you to believe it isn't." Parker shone his torch along the sill and the step. The stone was wet with drizzle, but the dampness showed up marks, a faint smear where mud had been wiped, and a line of powdered grit like pepper. "Recent," Parker said. "Recent," Whimsy agreed. "And cautious. Someone who wipes his feet does not expect to be chased." Denton gestured to the constable nearest. "Fetch the force. We'll have it opened." Whimsy's hand lifted. "Not yet." Denton's patience showed its teeth. "My lord, if you open a door," said Whimsy very gently, "with half the county behind you, you will find nothing but air and your own disappointment. If you open it with one small, perfectly placed assumption, you may find a man." He drew from his pocket, not a skeleton key, which would have been melodramatic, but the little brass key from Whelpdale's pocket, wrapped still in Denton's envelope. He did not go to the door with it. Instead, he walked around the lodge, listening as he went, like a physician taking the pulse of a sick room. At the back was a small window half obscured by ivy. The ivy had been cut, recently, and with care, so that the window could be opened. "Ah," said Whimsy, "the house's modesty has been altered." He knelt and examined the ground. There were prints, blurred by wet but discernible. A man's shoe, narrow and well made. Not a constable's heavy tread, not a labourer's broad hobnail. Denton muttered, "So someone's been in." "Yes," said Whimsy, and preferred not to use the front door, which suggests he either lacks the key or does not wish the lock to remember him. Parker said, "The private line. If the lodge is the end point, there might be—" Whimsy rose and went to the porch. Above the door frame was an old brass bell, the kind meant to be pulled from within by a wire. The wire was gone, but the bell remained, as decorative as a dead ear. "Mrs. Kedge said," Whimsy murmured, "that Whelpdale remarked the ghost had a telephone. Now I wonder if the ghost also has a bell." He tapped the bell lightly with his knuckle. It made no sound, not because bells are silent, but because its clapper had been removed. "A thoughtful ghost," said Whimsy. "One that dislikes announcing itself." Denton said, "We'll break in." Whimsy shook his head. "No, we shall be invited." He stepped back from the porch and spoke, not loudly but clearly, towards the lodge, as one might address a person behind a screen. "Mr. Whelpdale," he said pleasantly, "was a man of method. He would not have come here without knowing what he expected to find, and he would not have died holding a note from 1937 unless somebody wished him to." Nothing moved. The drizzle ticked on the leaves. Somewhere in the grange, a clock chimed the quarter with prim self-importance. Whimsy continued as though into a drawing room. "Sir Lionel's message advised us not to believe the clocks. Excellent advice. Clocks can be arranged. So can suicides. So can young secretaries with keys in their pockets." Denton's mouth tightened. "You're talking to nobody." "I am talking," said Whimsy, "to someone who is listening." He walked to the gate and touched the ironwork. His glove came away with a faint smear of grease. "Oiled," he observed, "to make it swing without squeal. One oils a gate when one expects to use it at night." Parker's torch moved across the gatepost. There, half hidden in the mortar, was a small black disc, bakelite neatly embedded, with a pinhole at its center. Parker froze. "Peter, look." Whimsy bent. "A microphone," he said softly, "or something remarkably like one. An earpiece for the house. Our ghost does not merely phone. He listens at the gate." Denton stared, then swore and motioned for one of his men. "Get the electrician from town. Now." Whimsy straightened, his face suddenly quite expressionless. "Inspector, if you summon half a county, you will frighten our inhabitant into vanishing. If you summon one competent man quietly, we may learn where the wires go." "And if he's in there now?" Denton demanded. Whimsy's eyes went to the curtained window. "Then he is enjoying himself enormously, because he believes we cannot enter without blundering." He lifted the brass key again and, this time, went to the front door. There was a keyhole, old, straight, a little worn at the edges. He inserted the key. It turned. The lock yielded with that small, intimate click which is more unsettling than any crash. Because it implies familiarity. Denton's hand went to his revolver. The constable stiffened, suddenly conscious of their own breathing. Whimsy did not fling the door wide. He opened it a fraction and stood listening. From inside came, very faintly, tick, tick, tick. Not the honest tick of a mantel clock, but the thin metallic tapping they had heard on the hidden receiver. The sound of a mechanism relaying time as signal, not measurement. Whimsy looked over his shoulder at Parker. "Charles," he said, "do you remember your old wireless set? When it took interference from the tram lines and pretended it was music?" Parker nodded slowly. "Yes." "This," said Whimsy, "is interference of a more deliberate kind." He pushed the door open. The lodge was not empty. It had been made to appear empty, the furniture covered, the grate cold, to the air stale. But in the corner, behind a screen, a small table stood bare of dust, and on it sat a compact apparatus of wires and batteries and a black handset, newer than the one in the clock case, yet of the same family, an internal line, jury-rigged and tended. Beside it lay a notebook and a fountain pen, uncapped as if used moments ago, and the chair before the table was still warm. Denton moved first, swift and heavy, crossing to the table. "Nobody," he hissed. Whimsy's gaze went not to the table, but to the hearth. There, under the grate, a few scraps of paper lay half-burned, their edges curled and browned, and in the ashes, something glinted. "A little brass," said Whimsy, kneeling. He took out his tweezers and lifted the object. It was a fragment of a key ring. Parker's voice was tight. He's destroying evidence." "Or tidying," said Whimsy. "Always that tidy." Denton strode to the back door and tried it. It was bolted from within, neatly. The windows were shut. The only obvious exit was the front door they had just entered. Whimsy rose, his expression mild again, but his eyes bright with a cold amusement. "He left," he said, "by the only route we have been watching, because he knew exactly where we were watching from." Denton swung on him. "Then how?" Whimsy lifted a finger. "Inspector, you're imagining a man running across open ground. I'm imagining a man who has lived with this house long enough to move through it as other men move through their own skin." He walked to the wall beside the telephone table and laid his palm flat against the paneling. It gave, not much, but enough. A faint vibration, or as of a wire under tension. "Under the plaster," he murmured, "a line to the Grange, and perhaps more than a line." Parker said quietly, "A passage." Whimsy's smile was brief. Not a passage of stone, necessarily, but a passage of habit, a way of coming and going that everybody has agreed not to see. Denton's eyes went to the covered furniture, the cold grate, the staged abandonment. Who would do this? Who's had access for years? Whimsy looked out of the lodge window towards the Grange, where one upstairs room showed a faint light like a watchful eye. "Somebody," he said, "who was taught in 1937 that the easiest way to kill a man is to make it look as though he killed himself. And who has been practicing the lesson ever since, on clocks, on servants, on memory." He turned back to the table and, with a kind of almost tender precision, touched the uncapped pen. "The ink is still wet," he said. Outside, very faintly, the village church bell began to ring. One solitary toll, wrong for the hour. Whimsy's head lifted. "That," he said softly, "is not a ghost." The bell's solitary toll came again, measured, reluctant, as though the rope were being pulled by a hand that wished, above all things, not to be overheard. It did not ring like a summons for worship. It rang like an alarm, disguised as a piety. Denton was already out of the lodge and signaling his men with the jerky economy of the frightened. Parker followed, stooping under the lintel, blinking as if the damp dusk had suddenly brightened into unpleasant clarity. Whimsy came last, closing the door with care. Care, not for the lodge, but for the story it had been rehearsing. "You heard that?" Denton demanded. "My dear Inspector," said Whimsy, "one does not live in England without hearing church bells. The question is, why are they ringing when nobody has died in the parish? Except the gentleman whose death, as it happens, is none of the church's business." He paused at the gate, listening. The bell was not continuing in the ordinary way. It struck, stopped, struck again. Single notes with gaps between them as though the ringer were counting. Parker's voice was low. "A signal." Denton made a savage motion. "To whom?" Whimsy's eyes travelled not to the tower, but along the line of the drive, towards the grange where the upstairs light glimmered. Then they travelled away again, towards the village, where the dark of the yews thickened and the road dipped out of sight. "To anyone," said Whimsy, "who has ever learned to count." He walked, without hurrying, back towards the Bentley. Hurry in Whimsy was a thing so rare that it must be saved for moments when it would be noticed, and at present, being noticed was precisely what their unseen antagonist desired. Denton, however, could not resist the vulgar impulse to run. "Constable, you, take the left. You, down to the lane. If you see anyone at all." "Do not," said Whimsy gently, "arrest the churchwarden." Denton swung round. "This is no time for—" "It is always time," said Whimsy, "for not making a fool of oneself in public." They were halfway to the car when a figure appeared on the drive ahead, coming towards them from the direction of the house, with that slow, deliberate gait which suggests a man who refuses to admit that the world can hurry him. It was Mr. Jasper Darracott. He had thrown a coat over his evening clothes as though he had dressed in a dream and woken too late to change. His face looked carved, his eyes shone in the failing light with a kind of brittle resentment. "What is going on?" he demanded. "My servants are in a panic." "The bell is ringing," said Whimsy, "as bells have been doing for centuries when people are frightened and wish to pretend they are only pious." Darracott stared at him. "You've been to the lodge?" "Yes," said Denton, "and it wasn't empty." Darracott's face whitened in a way that no amount of indignation could disguise. For a moment his mouth opened and closed as though searching for the right expression, like a man trying to find the polite word for impossible. "There's nothing in the lodge," he said finally. "It's been shut for years." "And yet," said Whimsy, "someone has been using it. Quite recently, with a telephone line that answers your clock room with, how shall we put it, a little musical tapping." Darracott's gaze flicked behind them towards the lodge, towards Denton's men. "This is ridiculous." "It is," agreed Whimsy. "But then, murder is frequently ridiculous until it becomes serious." The bell struck again. One single note. Darracott flinched as though he had been touched. Whimsy observed that flinch with the absorbed attention of a man watching a chess opponent's hand hover over a piece. "Mr. Darracott," he said, "you have lived here long enough to know who rings the bells." "What?" Darracott snapped. "The verger, or the sexton, or whoever is paid to do it." "No," said Whimsy. "Who has the right to do it? Who has the habit?" Darracott's nostrils flared. "I don't know. I don't concern myself," Parker said quietly. "The bell is being rung in single strokes, sir. Not for service, not for a funeral. That suggests a private signal. Do you know anyone who uses it so?" Darracott's eyes slid away, just for a second, towards the yews by the gate, towards that thick, private darkness where one could stand and see without being seen. Whimsy's voice softened, becoming almost conversationally kind. "When Sir Lionel died," he said, "you were a boy. You were told a story, that he was ill, unbalanced, that he locked himself in and hanged himself in a room full of clocks. You have been living inside that story ever since, because it was safer than the truth. But now, a man has been killed in the same room, holding your uncle's note. Somebody has been living in your lodge with a telephone line into your clock. And someone is ringing the bells as a signal to someone. This is the moment when you stop being the heir and become the witness. Darracot's throat worked. I don't know what you want me to say. I want you, said Whimsy gently, to tell me whether there is anybody connected with this house who has been before your time, but not, in fact, dead. Denton said harshly, You've got a squatter, an old servant, a relative. Darracot's hands clenched in the pockets of his coat. There was, he began, and stopped. Whimsy waited. He had the patience of a man who knows that confession is not extracted by force, but by removing the last excuse to remain silent. There was a man, Darracot said at last, in a low, tight voice. A man who used to come. When I was young, my father, he would have him to the house. Parker's pencil moved. Name? Darracot swallowed. Mr. Selwyn. Selwyn, repeated Whimsy. A Christian name? I never knew, said Darracot, the anger in him flickering up like a match. He was Mr. Selwyn. He was always Mr. Selwyn. He wasn't family, but he behaved as though he owned the place. He'd walk into rooms as if the doors opened for him by right. He'd ask questions about the clocks, about Sir Lionel, about what Sir Lionel had left behind. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. And your father allowed this? My father, said Darracot, with sudden bitterness, allowed everything that was convenient. The bell struck again. One note. A pause. Another note. Denton turned his head sharply. That's two. 2 strokes close together. Whimsy said softly. A tally, a count, and perhaps they are here, or he has spoken, or merely I am still alive. Darracot's face had the drawn look of a man who is seeing, for the first time, the shape of his own childhood fears. He used to frighten my mother, he said abruptly. Not openly. He was always polite. He frightened her by knowing things, by saying little things about the servants, about who had debts, about who wrote letters. He would smile and say, everything has its mechanism. Whimsy's mouth twitched. A man who believes people are clocks. Parker looked up. When did he last come? Darracot's voice dropped. Not for years, not since my father died, but... He hesitated, then said, almost in spite of himself, a few weeks ago I found the lodge gate oiled, like you said, and I told myself it was nothing, just weather or village boys. Whimsy's voice was very quiet. And did you tell Mr. Whelpdale about Mr. Selwyn? Darracot stared. No, but the denial lacked force. It was the denial of a man who has learned too late that the important lies are the ones you tell yourself. Denton said, We're going back to the church. We'll find who's ringing. Whimsy raised a hand. Inspector, if you go charging into the churchyard, you will find only villagers who have come out to see the excitement. Our bell ringer will vanish into the crowd like ink into water. Then what? Parker began. Whimsy's gaze went to the Granger's upstairs light again. We shall go back to the house, he said, and we shall do precisely what our friend expects. We shall behave as though we are frightened of ghosts. We shall lock doors, post men, patrol corridors, so make ourselves very visible and very noisy. Denton frowned. That's your plan? No, said Whimsy, and smiled with a flash of teeth. That is the plan we shall offer him. He turned slightly towards Darracot, who stood rigid, miserably attentive. Mr. Darracot, Whimsy said, you have a clock room that hides a telephone and a lodge that hides a man. You have a village bell that rings when somebody wishes to communicate without speaking. And you have, somewhere in your house, a mechanism older than any of us. One that turns fear into silence." The bell tolled once more, then stopped altogether, as abruptly as a mouth snapping shut. In the silence that followed, Whimsy's voice sounded almost conversational. "Now," he said, "our ghost has finished speaking. Let us see what he does when we answer." The return to the Grange had the quality of a formal retreat. Torches, constables, murmured orders. Yet beneath it ran a thin current of expectancy, as if everybody knew that the house was no longer merely a building but a participant. Denton had men at the front and back, men in the hall, men on the stairs, and the servants, summoned in a knot by Mrs. Craddock, stood in the dining room with the chastened, affronted faces of people whose private territory has been invaded by official boots. Whimsy watched them with an air of polite detachment, as though he were observing a mildly comic tableau at the theatre. Only Parker, who knew him too well, noticed that his eyes did not linger on faces but on distances, the space from door to door, the line of sight from the dining room threshold to the foot of the stairs, the exact angle at which the corridor lamps threw their pools of light. "Now then," said Denton briskly, addressing the assembled staff, "no one is to leave the house. No one is to go wandering about. If you've any information, anything you've seen, speak now." Silence answered him, the thick, customary silence of servants trained to believe that speech is always risky and never rewarded. Ivy Cattermole's gaze darted once towards Whimsy and away again, like a rabbit's. Whimsy took pity on Denton's bluntness, the way one takes pity on a man trying to open a watch with a chisel. "Mrs. Craddock," he said, "you will be so good as to tell us who has keys." Mrs. Craddock stiffened. "Keys, my lord." "Keys," said Whimsy, "for the outer doors, for cupboards, for wine, for anything at all that is not meant to be touched." "My lord, this house is full of locks that are not meant to be used," Whimsy finished pleasantly, "and yet someone has been using them. Let us not pretend that respectability abolishes mechanics." Mrs. Craddock's lips tightened. "There is the hall key, kept in the drawer. There are pantry keys, linen room keys. Mr. Darracott has his own." "And the lodge?" asked Parker. "The lodge has been shut," said Mrs. Craddock too quickly. "Since before your time," said Whimsy and smiled. "We are making progress." Denton said sharply, "Who had access to the hall drawer last night, after 9 o'clock?" Cook, a large woman with the air of one who considers murder an inconvenient disturbance to the dinner schedule, sniffed. The footman shifted. A parlour-maid coloured. Nothing was said. Miss Whimsy, as though idly, crossed to the sideboard and lifted the silver-framed holiday photograph again, the one he had examined earlier. He turned it slightly so the dining-room lights caught it. "Mrs. Darracott," he remarked, "is away at Bournemouth. How perfectly safe. Nothing so encourages wickedness as the absence of the person who would notice it." Jasper Darracott, who had been hovering at the edge of the room like a man afraid of his own carpets, flared. "Are you accusing my wife now?" "Not at all," said Whimsy. "I am accusing your house. It has been keeping secrets from you, and houses, like people, do not keep secrets without practice." He set the photograph down and, without warning, looked straight at Ivy. "Miss Cattermole," he said, "when you told Mr. Whelpdale the bell wires had been removed, you spoke as if you had seen it. Have you?" Ivy's hands twisted in her apron. No, my lord. Mrs. Craddock said—" Mrs. Craddock's chin rose. "The old bells were taken out. Everyone knows that." "Everyone," said Whimsy, "knows whatever they are told often enough." He walked to the hall door and opened it. The hall clock ticked with smug regularity. Whimsy stood a moment, head slightly inclined, as though listening to a faint voice at a distance. Then he closed the door again and returned to the servants. "Inspector Denton," he said mildly, "would you oblige me by having one of your men go to the clock room and lift the hidden receiver in the moon clock, now?" Denton hesitated. "Why?" "Because," said Whimsy, "our friend has been ringing bells in the village to send messages. Perhaps he also uses his little private mechanism to hear ours." Denton barked an order. Yet a constable went. Whimsy turned back to the room. "Meanwhile, Mrs. Craddock, I should like you to send, quite calmly, for tea." There was a collective blink. Tea in a house full of policemen and one dead secretary sounded indecent. "For the staff as well," Whimsy added. "Shock is dehydrating. Also, people talk better with something in their hands." Denton stared at him as though he had lost what remained of his mind. Parker, however, saw the point at once. Tea created motion, trays, kettles, cupboards opened, habits exposed. And habits, as Whimsy had already observed, were the tides of a household. Mrs. Craddock drew a breath that suggested she would rather swallow a duster. "Very good, my lord." She moved too briskly to the door. Whimsy's voice stopped her gently. "One thing," he said. "Do not use the pantry kettle, or use the scullery kettle." Mrs. Craddock froze. Parker's pencil stopped as abruptly as a clock's second hand. Denton said, "What the devil?" Whimsy's tone remained airy, but his eyes had narrowed into that bright, intense stillness that preceded his most dangerous conclusions. "The pantry kettle," Whimsy said, "is too close to the hall drawer, too close to keys, too close to the little places in which people hide small objects when they are frightened and have no time to think. Whereas the scullery kettle, if I remember my English houses, requires one to cross the corridor by the back stairs. It will show us who can move through this house without being seen." Mrs. Craddock's face had gone the color of old paper. "You're talking nonsense," Darracott burst out. This is theatricals." "Quite," said Whimsy. "And what is murder, after all, but a theatrical performance in which someone insists on being the only actor with a script?" At that moment, one of Denton's men returned from the corridor, not the constable sent to the clock room, but another, younger one, with the uneasy expression of a man who has found something he does not wish to report. "Inspector," he said, there's a man at the back, by the service door. Says he's come about the bells." Denton's head snapped round. "Bring him in." The servants made a little involuntary shifting movement, an almost imperceptible recoil, as though the words about the bells had the power to summon something unwelcome. Whimsy's gaze went to Jasper Darracott. "Do you employ a verger?" Darracott licked his lips. "The church has people. I don't." "Splendid," said Whimsy. "An unknown person with a legitimate excuse, and that is always the most convenient species of visitor." The man was brought in, tall, thin, in a dark coat shiny with drizzle, with a hat in his hands which he held too carefully, as though it were part of his face. He looked about 55, but it was the kind of 55 that has been achieved through effort, careful grooming, careful posture, careful control. His eyes were pale, his mouth set in a courteous line. "I beg your pardon," he said, in a voice that was indeed rather vicar-like in its trained softness. "I was told there was some concern about the bell. I am Mr. Selwyn." There was a pause, so complete that it seemed the house itself had stopped ticking to listen. Jasper Darracott made a small sound, halfway between anger and recognition. Whimsy inclined his head as though greeting an acquaintance at a club. "Mr. Selwyn," he said, "how very obliging of you to materialize on cue. We were beginning to think we should have to go hunting in attics and lodges." Selwyn's smile did not falter. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "No," said Whimsy gently. "That is because you have been in the habit, for a great many years, of arranging other people's understanding. Inspector Denton, this gentleman may be asked to remain. Mr. Selwyn, do sit down. You are, if I mistake not, about to hear a great deal of the past." Selwyn's eyes flicked, quick as a clock's hand, to Mrs. Craddock, and then away again. It was the smallest glance in the world. But Whimsy saw it. "So," Whimsy continued lightly, "let us talk about mechanisms, about bell signals, about private telephone lines, and about how in 1937 a man in this house wrote, 'Ask about the key that was not lost.'" Selwyn's expression remained perfectly composed. Only his hand, holding the hat, tightened, just enough to crease the brim. Selwyn sat when invited, because he could not very well do otherwise without making a scene, and he sat as though he had arranged the chair beforehand, measuring its distance from the fire, the side table, the faces. His hat lay upon his knees with an air of respectability that was, in itself, faintly insulting. "You will forgive me," he said, "if I say that I have no notion what any of this has to do with me. I was rung up," he allowed himself the smallest, patient emphasis, "by the verger. There has been confusion about the bell." "The bell," repeated Whimsy, and accepted the word as one accepts a compliment, with thanks and a private reservation. "Yes, the bell is a simple object. It requires only a rope and a hand. What fascinates me, Mr. Selwyn, is not that you came about it, but that you came at precisely the moment when that bell had finished saying whatever it had to say." Selwyn's smile remained. "Coincidence. Coincidence," said Whimsy, "is what we call the part of the pattern we have not yet traced." Denton, hovering by the door like a displeased mastiff, could restrain himself no longer. "Name and address," he barked. Selwyn provided them at once, too readily, too neatly, like a man producing a card from a well-organized case. He lived, it appeared, in a small cottage on the edge of the village. He was retired. He had interests. He had known the Derricotts in former years. Jasper Derricott stood rigid by the sideboard, and his face working as though it were attempting to grind some old memory into a shape it could swallow. "You," he said suddenly, and the word was not accusation but recognition sharpened into hatred. "I told you, you had no right, after my father." Selwyn turned his pale eyes upon him with mild surprise. "My dear Jasper, I thought you would be glad of an old friend in a time of distress." "You were never a friend," Derricott said, and his voice cracked on the last word like a floorboard giving way. Whimsy watched this exchange with that curious, attentive amusement which made him appear, at such moments, not frivolous, but frightening, like a man smiling at a knife. "Let us keep to mechanisms," he said gently. "Mr. Selwyn, you have heard, I think, that Mr. Whelpdale is dead." Selwyn's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Thus I heard there had been an unfortunate occurrence." "How delicate," said Whimsy. "Yes, he was found in the clock-room, struck from behind. He held in his hand." Whimsy's tone remained conversational, but something in it had tightened. "A note dated 31st October, 1937, signed L.D. You will recall, perhaps, that those are Sir Lionel Derricott's initials." Selwyn's gaze did not flicker. Only his breathing altered, so slightly that one might have attributed it to the fire. "I'm afraid," he said, "that I have no knowledge of Sir Lionel's handwriting." Whimsy nodded. "Naturally, one can do a great deal in this world without knowledge, provided one has access." Parker, who had been quiet, spoke now with professional flatness. "Mr. Selwyn, did you visit Rookwood Grange last night?" Selwyn spread his hands. "Certainly not, and I have no reason to." "And did you visit the lodge?" Parker added. "The lodge?" Selwyn looked genuinely puzzled, or performed puzzlement with extraordinary skill. "I have not been in the lodge since it was occupied years ago." "Occupied?" Whimsy murmured. "By whom?" Selwyn's eyes shifted, just a shade, to Mrs. Craddock, who stood near the dining-room door with her hands folded as if containing herself. Then he returned his gaze to Whimsy. "It was," he said carefully, "a gatekeeper's lodge. Gatekeepers come and go." "Do they?" said Whimsy. "Or do they remain in another form when it is convenient?" Denton slammed a palm on the table. The servants jumped. "We found a telephone apparatus in the lodge this evening," he said. "Recent. Warm chair. Wet ink. Someone's been using it. Someone has access to this house from that lodge. And someone rang the church bell in single strokes tonight, like a signal. Are you telling me you know nothing?" Selwyn regarded Denton with a kind of patient pity, as though the inspector's emotional range were a regrettable limitation. "Inspector, you're excited. Excitement leads to mistakes. I came because I was asked to come. If you have evidence of criminal behavior, I'm sure you will present it in the usual way." "In the usual way?" said Whimsy softly. "Yes, the usual way is so soothing to men who know how to arrange it." He turned his head slightly. "Mrs. Craddock." "My lord?" "I believe you were going to make tea," said Whimsy. "In the scullery. Do so now." Mrs. Craddock did not move. Whimsy's voice remained perfectly courteous. "Now, if you please." She moved at last, stiffly, out of the dining room, though Selwyn's eyes followed her for a fraction of a second, then returned to Whimsy, and the smile became, for the first time, a trifle less serene. Whimsy, as though he had noticed nothing, resumed. "Mr. Selwyn, do you have a key to the clock room?" "No." "To the lodge?" "No." "To any part of this house?" Selwyn's tone sharpened politely. "I have no keys because I have no business here." "Excellent," said Whimsy. "Then you will not mind telling us how it happened that the key found on Mr. Whelpdale fitted both the lodge door and the concealed panel within the moon-phase clock." Selwyn's eyes widened a hair's breadth. "I cannot comment on a key I have never seen." "But you can comment," said Whimsy, "on the kind of man who would carry it. Mr. Whelpdale came to this village, asked after Sir Lionel, asked after bells, asked after the lodge, and wrote things down in a little notebook. Then he died in the clock room holding Sir Lionel's last message, as though it had been delivered to him at the crucial moment. By whom, Mr. Selwyn? By a ghost? Or by someone who has been keeping a private line to the house since 1937? Selwyn sat very still. The hat on his knees did not move. His hands, beautifully kept, rested upon it with a gentle pressure, as though pinning it down. "I think," he said at last, "Lord Peter, that you are a man of imagination." "I am," said Whimsy, "but I try to keep it on a leash. The trouble with imagination is that it sees possibilities. Logic, on the other hand, sees necessities." He glanced at Parker. "Charles, will you be so good as to read aloud the note again?" Parker produced the paper, now protected in an evidence sleeve, and read, with careful neutrality, "If you are reading this, I'm already gone. Do not believe the clocks. Ask about the key that was not lost. L.D." Whimsy nodded. "Now, let us be dull. Let us be literal. The key was not lost, therefore it was taken. And if it was taken in 1937, it was taken by someone who had access to Sir Lionel at the moment of his death, or immediately after." He turned gently to Jasper Darracott. "Your father, Mr. Darracott, did he ever speak of Sir Lionel's death to you?" Darracott's face twisted. "Only to say, never mention it, not to my mother, not to anyone. He said, Sir Lionel was shameful. And Mr. Selwyn," said Whimsy, "was your father's friend." Darracott's voice came out hoarse. "He was my father's advisor. He called him that." "Advisor," repeated Whimsy. "How charmingly vague. To like retired and interests." Selwyn's voice was calm, but there was now a thin wire of irritation in it. "This is quite enough. I'm not obliged to submit to insinuations in a private house." Denton said grimly, "You're obliged to remain while we investigate a murder." Selwyn rose, and it was in that moment, when Selwyn moved with the assurance of a man accustomed to doors opening, that Whimsy, who had been watching the room's geometry all along, saw what the others missed. Selwyn did not glance towards the front hall or the obvious exit. His body angled infinitesimally towards the servants' corridor. towards the back stairs, towards the scullery, towards Mrs. Craddock and the kettle. Whimsy spoke softly, almost lazily, yet every syllable landed like a placed weight. "Don't," he said. Selwyn's head turned. "Yeah, don't what?" "Don't go after your keys," said Whimsy and smiled. "Because I have just remembered something about tea, Mr. Selwyn. It takes time to boil, and you, I fancy, dislike waiting unless you are the one making others do it." For the first time, Selwyn's composure slipped, only a fraction, but enough. His hand went, not to his hat, but to his coat pocket. Denton's constables moved. Parker's voice sharpened. "Inspector—" Selwyn's fingers came out holding something small and dark. Not a weapon, a whistle. He put it to his lips. And before he could blow, Whimsy stepped forward with sudden, precise violence, wholly at odds with his languid manner, struck the whistle aside and said very quietly, into Selwyn's astonished face, "You may ring bells in the village, sir. You may tap on wires. But you will not summon your ghosts in my presence." Selwyn recoiled, more from surprise than pain. His eyes snapped to the dining-room door. From the corridor came the sound, faint but unmistakable, of a kettle being set upon a hob. Whimsy's head tilted, listening as though to music. "Ah," he said softly. "There we are. The house is about to speak." He turned to Denton. "Inspector, if you please, 2 men to the scullery, quietly. And whatever you do, don't let Mrs. Craddock out of your sight." The 2 constables went, not quietly enough for Whimsy's taste, but quietly enough for a police force raised on village crimes and sudden respect for polished floors. Their boots made a soft, reluctant complaint along the passage. Then the sound was swallowed by the back of the house, where servants and kettles and secrets all tend to congregate. But Whimsy did not follow. He remained in the dining-room doorway, as though he had suddenly become no more than an interested guest at his own entertainment. He had the curious habit, in moments of genuine tension, of appearing almost frivolous, like a man who refuses to grant panic the dignity of attention. Selwyn stood very still, hat now abandoned on the chair, his hands empty and held slightly away from his body in the attitude of a man who wishes to appear reasonable. His pale eyes went once towards Denton, once towards Parker, and finally settled upon Whimsy with a kind of contained hostility that had, until now, been kept under glass. "You are taking a great deal upon yourself," Selwyn said. "I always do," said Whimsy mildly. "It saves time. Speaking of which, time is precisely what we are discussing, is it not? Time and bells and wires and the silly human belief that one may ring for assistance without anyone hearing." Darracott had sunk into a chair as though his bones had abandoned him. His face, in the lamplight, looked younger and more unpleasantly honest. "I never knew," he muttered, "not to them, but to the room. I swear to God I never knew." Whimsy's gaze touched him briefly, sympathetic, but not indulgent. "You knew enough to be frightened," he said, "and fear is a form of knowledge." In the corridor, the kettle gave a thin, rising hiss, the first impatient whisper of water beginning to heat. The sound was domestic, almost comic, and yet, in the stillness, it took on an odd significance like a stage cue. Selwyn's mouth tightened. "This is absurd. You have no right to—" "Rights," said Whimsy. "Yes, Englishmen are so fond of them. But rights are merely habits dressed in legal language. You, Mr. Selwyn, have lived by habit for a long time. The habit of appearing where you are wanted. The habit of removing unpleasant objects, keys, notes, witnesses, and calling it tidying. The habit of turning other people's lives into mechanisms." Selwyn's eyes narrowed. "You have imagination, Lord Peter. It will mislead you." "I'm not being imaginative," said Whimsy gently. "I'm being dull. There was a key that was lost in 1937. It wasn't lost. It was taken. The taking required access to Sir Lionel at the crucial moment. A servant saw enough to be frightened into burning paper. A bell system was disconnected and replaced by something quieter. A private line was hidden in the moon clock and its twin in the lodge. And when our modern secretary went looking for the truth, he died precisely as Sir Lionel died, arranged. All this is not imagination. It is a pattern with far too many repetitions to be accidental. Denton's jaw worked. If you're saying Selwyn did the 1937 business, he'd have been, what, in his 20s? And you're saying he's been squatting in a lodge for years? Selwyn gave a small laugh, entirely without humor. What a melodrama. Whimsy's voice, still light, acquired an edge like a sharpened paper knife. No, Inspector, I'm saying he has had access to the lodge for years, possibly through someone else, someone who knows the back stairs as well as she knows the front parlor, someone who can move keys without being seen and can boil a kettle while listening at a door. His eyes went, for the first time, fully and directly, to the empty space where Mrs. Craddock had stood. And Selwyn's composure shifted by a hair's breadth, an involuntary tightening around the mouth, like a man feeling a string draw taut. He said nothing, but his silence had suddenly become active. Parker murmured, "Peter." "Hush," said Whimsy softly. "Listen." From the scullery came a sound, faint, metallic, unmistakable. A clink, as of something small set down on enamel. Then another, the slide of a drawer. Then, very faintly indeed, a thin, deliberate tap, 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 as though someone were striking a piece of metal lightly against a surface in a rhythm meant to be felt rather than heard. Parker's eyes widened. "She's signaling." "To whom?" Denton hissed. Whimsy's head tilted. "To the house," he said. "To the wires." He moved at last, not running but with swift, purposeful grace, down the corridor toward the back. Denton and Parker followed. Derricott stumbled after them like a man dragged by his own disgrace. Behind them, Selwyn remained in the dining room, watched by a constable. Yet in that moment, his stillness looked less like patience and more like calculation. The servants' corridor narrowed, the air changing subtly. Warmer, damper, smelling of soap and boiled vegetables and the honest labor of keeping genteel people alive. The scullery door was half closed. Through the gap came the hiss of the kettle, now approaching impatience, and Mrs. Craddock's voice, low, not speaking to anyone, but murmuring as though counting. Whimsy pushed the door open. Mrs. Craddock stood by the range. The kettle sat on the hob, trembling slightly. On the table beside her lay a small object, a black bakelite earpiece, like the disc Parker had seen in the gatepost, it with wires trailing from it like roots. Her hand hovered above it as though she had been interrupted mid-prayer. Two constables stood inside the scullery, uncertain, caught between the instinct to seize and the deep English reluctance to lay hands upon a housekeeper in her own domain. Mrs. Craddock's face was quite calm. The calm of a woman who has polished silver while hearing confessions, who has cleaned blood out of rugs without altering her expression, who has learned that propriety is armor. "My lord," she said, "you have no business in here." Whimsy looked at the bakelite disc, then at the wires, then at her hands. "No," he agreed softly. "I have a great deal of business in here." Denton stepped forward. "What's that on the table?" Mrs. Craddock's eyes flicked to it and back. "Rubbish. Something old from the lodge. Now the men brought it in." "One does not place rubbish," said Whimsy, "so carefully, nor tap it as though it were a friend." Parker, bending, saw what Whimsy had already seen. The wires were not loose. They ran through a small, crude hole in the skirting board, a hole newly drilled and then neatly filled about with putty the color of old paint. Denton's voice hardened. "You've got a line, a listening line." Mrs. Craddock's mouth tightened. "You don't understand." "That," said Whimsy, "is always the servant's last refuge." "And sometimes it is true." He moved closer, his tone now almost gentle. "Mrs. Craddock, were you at Rookwood Grange in 1937? Her eyes did not move. "No, my lord." "Were you Annie Marr?" he asked quietly. The kettle gave a sudden, furious shriek as steam began to force itself out. An indecent domestic scream. And one of the constables flinched. Mrs. Craddock's eyelids fluttered at last, once, and in that tiny movement the whole room seemed to shift. She reached, not for the kettle, not for the earpiece, but for the drawer by the range. Whimsy's hand shot out and caught her wrist, not brutally, but with that exact pressure that makes resistance pointless. "Don't," he said softly, as he had said to Selwyn. Mrs. Craddock stared at him. For the first time her face broke, not into tears, but into something like contempt. "You gentlemen," she said, very low, "you don't know what it is to keep a house from falling apart." "What was in the drawer?" demanded Denton. Whimsy released her wrist and nodded to one of the constables. The drawer was pulled open. Inside lay a small ring of keys. Old keys. Modern keys. One thin brass key worn to a polish, and its bow smooth as a worry stone. "The key that was not lost," said Whimsy, almost gently. Mrs. Craddock's eyes closed for a moment as though she had been struck, not by a clock weight, but by the sheer exhaustion of being caught. Parker's voice was quiet. "So Whelpdale found out. He came to you." Mrs. Craddock opened her eyes. "He came to the wrong person," she said, and there was now, beneath her control, something like fear. Denton said sharply, "Did Selwyn give you that line? Did he set you to watch us?" Mrs. Craddock's mouth trembled. Only once. Then she said, with sudden, bitter clarity, "Mr. Selwyn doesn't set anyone to do anything. He only makes it seem like it was your own idea." Whimsy's gaze went to the kettle, screaming on the hob, and he reached over and took it off, setting it down with careful composure, and as though refusing to let any domestic object outdo a human confession. "Mrs. Craddock," he said softly, "you have been the mechanism." And from the passage beyond the scullery came a new sound, a footstep, light, quick, precise, moving away towards the back stairs, as if someone, hearing the confession begin, had decided it was time to vanish while the house still offered him its old, obliging roots. Selwyn was gone by the time they reached the back stairs. It was not the melodramatic vanishing of a stage villain with cloaks and laughter. It was the practical disappearance of a man who had spent his life cultivating exits. A servant's corridor leads into a house the way a vein leads into a body, quietly, indispensably, and without being noticed until it is cut. Denton thundered up first, 2 constables at his heels, and Parker after them. Whimsy came last, because there are 2 kinds of speed, the kind that runs and the kind that arrives. Halfway up, Whimsy stopped, laid his hand on the banister, and looked at the polished wood. "Still tacky," he said softly. Parker turned. "What?" "Oil," said Whimsy. "Fresh. The same consideration as the gate. He's been preparing surfaces, quieting them, making the house cooperative." Above, Denton's shout came down the stairwell. "Front landing! Cover the corridor! Don't let him through!" A door slammed, not with panic but with decision. Then another sound, subtle and far worse, the soft click of a latch being turned with unhurried familiarity. Whimsy lifted his voice, not loud, but pitched to carry. "Mr. Selwyn," he called, "you have always had an absurd faith in the obedience of mechanisms. But mechanisms, like people, break when they are forced too often." For an instant there was silence, and then Selwyn's voice floated back, mild as a vicar's blessing. "Lord Peter, you are very tiresome." Denton burst onto the landing, found himself confronted by 3 doors and a corridor that branched, and swore as though profanity were a kind of prayer. "Which way?" he snapped. Whimsy did not answer at once. He listened. From somewhere ahead, faint but distinct, came the thin tap-tap-tap they had heard in the scullery. Not from the scullery now, from within the house itself. A signaling, not to warn, but to test whether the line still carried. "He's on the internal wire," Whimsy said. "He's checking who can hear him." Parker's face tightened. "From where?" Whimsy's eyes went to the nearest door, a narrow one, painted the color of old cream, with a little brass knob. Exactly the sort of door nobody in the family would open unless compelled. "That," he said quietly, "is a cupboard door pretending to be a room. Cupboards are where housekeepers keep the past." Denton flung it open. It was not a cupboard. It was a small service landing, and beyond it a cramped room. Once a sewing room, perhaps, now stripped to utilitarian bareness. A chair, a table, and in the corner, half hidden by a hanging cloth, another bakelite disc with wires, and beside it, a narrow trap in the floor, its edges rubbed bright by repeated lifting. "Jesus," said Denton. Whimsy leaned over the trap and sniffed, absurdly, like a man assessing a wine. "Warm air," he observed, "and dust disturbed in the last minute. He's gone down." "Cellars?" Parker asked. "No," said Whimsy. "Not a cellar. A crawl space, a priest hole for modern times. A place you could live in without being seen if you had a housekeeper to bring you bread and silence." Darracott appeared behind them, white-faced, clutching the banister as though it were the only honest thing in his inheritance. "That's," he whispered, "that's impossible. There is always an isn't in old houses," said Whimsy with sudden gentleness. "That is how they remain respectable." Denton's constables were already moving, lifting the trap with a crowbar. It came up more easily than it should have. Somebody had oiled that too. A dark void yawned beneath, and the smell rose. Brick dust, old plaster, mouse, and something else. Something faintly medicinal, like clean gloves. Denton snapped. "Torch! Now!" A beam cut down into the space, revealing a narrow, brick-lined passage running beneath the floorboards. Not a grand secret tunnel. Nothing so romantic. Just the kind of practical void that might have been left for pipes, and then, later, made useful by a man who preferred his secrets low and close. Halfway along, the passage turned. And at that turn, something pale moved, quickly. "Stop!" Denton roared. There was a thud, a scramble, a sharp intake of breath. And then Selwyn's voice again, very near now, from below, with that maddening courtesy. "Inspector, I should be careful. There are wires." A constable, over-eager, put his boot down. And the house answered, not with a ghost, but with physics. A sharp crack, the sudden give of a board, and the constable went down on his knee with a cry as a nail tore through the leather. "Idiot!" Denton snapped. Whimsy's voice cut in, and precise and calm. "Nobody else moves until I say so." They all froze. Even Denton. Whimsy knelt, leaned into the open trap, and shone his own small torch along the edge. There, nearly invisible in the gloom, ran a fine line of wire across the passage, at shin height. "A trip," he said, "and likely connected to something noisier than a bell pull. Mr. Selwyn is old-fashioned, but he is not uneducated." Parker swallowed. "An alarm. Or an electrocution," said Whimsy. "Or merely a light that comes on and tells him exactly where you are. The principle is the same. A man who believes in mechanisms believes that you will behave mechanically." He looked up at Denton. "Inspector, you will do what policemen hate. You will wait." Denton's face purpled. "He'll get away." Whimsy's tone was almost affectionate. "Where to?" "He has lived by the house. See, the house is not a horse he can ride away. He will go to one of his accustomed exits, one that requires keys and silence. And we have the keys now." He rose and turned, not to the trap, but back towards the stairs. "Mrs. Craddock," he called. She stood below, in the passage, flanked by a constable, her face set in that bleak composure of a woman whose entire life has been discovered to be a corridor. "Yes, my lord." "Where does that passage come out?" Whimsy asked quietly. Her mouth trembled once. Then she said, very low, "Into the clock room." Darracot made a small, strangled noise. Whimsy nodded, as though confirming what he had known for hours. "Of course," he murmured. "The house keeps its own time. The house keeps its own ways." He turned to Parker. "Charles, take 2 men. Go to the clock room. Don't burst in. Don't touch anything. Just wait by the moon clock with the concealed panel open." Parker's eyes met his. "You think he'll come that way?" "I think," said Whimsy, "that he cannot resist it. Men like Selwyn always return to the instrument they first learned to play. 1937 was his debut. He will want, desperately, to end his performance in the same room." Denton barked orders. Men scattered, boots muffled now by caution and shame. Whimsy went down the stairs again to the scullery, where Mrs. Craddock stood like a captured fortress. He stopped before her, and for a moment his ironic mask slipped, showing something colder and more weary. "Annie Marr," he said softly. "You weren't the niece. You were Elspeth Marr's niece, and you became her successor. You were there in 1937. Mrs. Craddock's eyes did not flinch now. "I was there," she said. "And you burned a paper," said Whimsy. "Yes." "And you kept the key," said Whimsy. Her mouth hardened. "He kept it, Mr. Selwyn. I only kept it safe." Whimsy's voice was very quiet. "Safe for whom?" She stared at him then, and for the first time the armor of propriety showed the bruise beneath. "Safe," she whispered, "for the house. For the name. For the children. For—" She swallowed. "He said it would ruin them. He said it would ruin me. And he was right." Whimsy nodded once as though accepting the bleak arithmetic. "Yes," he said, "that is how he has lived. By telling women the truth is more ruinous than murder." From somewhere deep within the Grange, far off but unmistakable, a clock chimed 1, 2, 3, though it was not the hour. It was irregular, wrong, like a laugh breaking through manners. Whimsy's head lifted. "Aye, there," he said softly. "He's moved. He's in the clock room." Denton, who had just re-entered the hall, heard it too and went rigid. "That's not possible. We've men—" Whimsy's smile was thin. "Inspector," he said, "he has been walking through your men for years. The only difference tonight is that the house is no longer on his side." They moved, swiftly now, with the dreadful certainty of the last act. In the corridor outside the horologium, Parker waited with his men. The door stood ajar. The ticking inside sounded louder than it had any right to. Whimsy stepped to the threshold and spoke into the room as though addressing an invisible guest. "Mr. Selwyn," he said, "you may come out. The bells are finished, the keys are found, and the clocks," his voice sharpened with quiet contempt, "are no longer yours to arrange." A pause. Then Selwyn's voice came from within, calm and faintly amused. "Lord Peter," he said, "you have always been clever, but cleverness is not the same thing as power." Whimsy entered. The moon-phase long case stood with its secret panel open, like a mouth that had been forced to confess. The black receiver lay on the little shelf, and beside it stood Selwyn, neat, unruffled, as though he had merely stepped out of a drawing-room. In his hand he held a clock weight, heavy, dull metal, the same kind of object that could end a life with one efficient blow. He smiled politely. "It is touching," he said, "how you all believe this is about keys." Whimsy's gaze went not to the weight, but to Selwyn's eyes. "No," he said softly. "It is about control, and you, poor devil, have mistaken control for safety." Selwyn's smile twitched. Safety is always control. And love, said Whimsy very quietly, is precisely what you have never understood. For the first time, Selwyn's composure cracked. Just a fissure, a flash of something furious and boyish beneath the cultivated serenity. He lifted the weight, and in that instant, Parker's men surged forward. Denton's shout filled the corridor, and Selwyn, trapped at last by the very machinery he adored, found that the house had only one final message to give him. Not a ghost, a reckoning.